Alright, and we're back with the video that makes everyone mad at me. Today I'm going to be talking about players that I think you should not draft, and I kind of say that, not to say not to draft them ever, but just that I think they're getting drafted way earlier than they should be, so I'm going to talk about where I think they should be getting drafted at, and just kind of make my case as to why you shouldn't draft these players where they're typically getting drafted by. So to use my metrics, I'm using ESPN's average draft position, which you can see under players if you go onto your league and look at the live draft trends, while also using the rank, which is the place that these players typically get drafted at in the average draft. So starting off my list, I have Paolo Banchero, not really too sure how you say it exactly, like I'm horrible with the pronunciations, but his average draft position is 33.8 and his rank is 32. I just really don't understand what he's doing up this high. That's ahead of guys like Karl Anthony Towns, Jaren Jackson Jr., Zion, Randall, and Harden. And I think people get a bit too infatuated with the idea of young players always taking a jump in their next year when there's really not a guarantee that that's going to happen. Like, if we look at his last season, he wasn't that stellar for fantasy. His three-point shooting was terrible. His efficiency suffered at times. And yes, I'm expecting some growth out of him this season. I think he will be a better player. But to put him up at this high of a draft pick, I just think is a mistake, just because there's so many better options available that people seem to just be ignoring. So, I mean, ESPN has him projected to average around 40.5 fantasy points per game this year. Last year, he averaged 31, and I do think he's going to have more than 31, but on my personal draft board, I had him all the way down at 55, and I was pretty comfortable with that. I'm just really not seeing the logic in how he's going to average 40 fantasy points per game. I think they're just expecting a huge jump in every statistical category, even though the Magic haven't really changed that much of their team, and I'm not really certain that just because Paolo is going into his second year that he's going to be this much better as a fantasy player. So just really interesting, and I'm not really too clear on why people are this high on Paolo. Maybe I'm underestimating his value, but I mean, if, like I said, I already listed some of the guys he's getting drafted ahead of, and I would just there's so many other options that I would draft ahead of Paolo just because I think it's a safer bet that they're going to have better fantasy production than he is. So yeah, I just really so I just want to make this explicitly clear. I'm not saying under any circumstance do not draft Paolo. I'm just saying drafting him at 32 is kind of insane to me. I would be more comfortable taking him around the 50s. So you can disagree. Feel free to let me know in the comments if you disagree. Maybe you feel comfortable taking him in the 40s. That's perfectly fine. I'm just making the case that I don't think you should draft Paolo at 32 because I think there's plenty of better options, and it's kind of a waste of your pick if you draft him there. Alright, before I forget, don't forget to subscribe and join the Discord through the link in the description if you want to ask any fantasy questions, get my top 100 rankings, or just overall want to talk about basketball. Really great community in there, so highly recommend doing that. But anyways, next up is DeAndre Aton. His average draft position is 66.9 and his rank is 57. And he's personally someone I found that I'm a bit lower on than most people from what I'm seeing in comments and stuff like that. But he's getting drafted ahead of guys like Fred VanVleet, Franz Wagner, Miles Turner, Nick Claxton, and Bradley Beal, just to name but a few. There's obviously a lot more. I'm just kind of putting in like a few guys that I would definitely draft over DeAndre Ayton, and I'm not really understanding why he's going so early, especially when you consider like he's going to be splitting minutes with Robert Williams. It looks like from the preseason that their lineups, Robert Williams hasn't been playing, but still I just really don't see how you can play both of them and Scoot Henderson, who's not a great three-point shooter yet. At the same time, your spacing will just be too terrible, so I really think he's probably going to be splitting minutes. I think he averages around 32 fantasy points per game this year. I have him all the way down at 86 on my ranking, so I mean, I just really don't see why. Like, he's at 57 as I showed from my rankings. Last year, he averaged like 38 fantasy points per game, or 35 fantasy points per game, excuse me. And this season, I really don't see how he maintains that. I definitely think there's a drop, and given that drop, there's just no way he stays all the way up in the 50s range for a draft pick. I mean, come on, guys. What are we doing here? There's just so many better options, even for centers like Nick Claxton, Miles Turner. They're both right there. I'm a lot more confident in their production. And yes, he still has Scoot Henderson, who looks to be a pretty decent playmaker, and he's going to be hitting him on lobs and stuff like that. But it's just overall, I don't know what DeAndre Ayton is really going to give you that's going to take him up to the level where he's getting drafted at, which is averaging around 35, if not more, fantasy points per game. So I definitely consider staying away from drafting him until he falls, unless he falls a bit later. Like I said, I have him at 86, but I mean, if you can get him in like the 70s, I think that's a good, perfectly decent pick. Maybe even in like the later 60s, but 57 is just a lot too early, and you can get a lot more value if you sort of lend your pick elsewhere this year. So I won't go into too much detail on him because I already talked about him a bit previously in my rankings video, so you can go check that out. The link will probably be in the description if you're interested. So anyways, going ahead, getting on to the next player now. All right, so next up we have Keegan Murray. He's a guy that I don't really understand why he's getting drafted this high. I mean, likewise with all these guys, I'm just really not seeing the logic here. But his average draft position is around 91, his rank 81. This is ahead of guys like Chris Paul, Trey Jones, OG Anunoby, Keldon Johnson, Ben Simmons, and Wendell Carter Jr. And Keegan Murray is a good player, don't get me wrong. It's just he's pretty much stuck in the 3-and-D role for the Kings. He's at best the fourth option when he's playing in the starting lineup, and there's just not a lot of looks to go around for him. Last year he averaged 12 points per game, 4.6 rebounds, 1 assist. He doesn't really give you anything in the steals or blocks department. And for some reason ESPN has him projected to just sort of take a rather large leap, and I'm not really too sure why, because it's not like it wasn't because he was a good player. His role is just very limited on the team he's currently on. So I do think he's going to have a good season. He's going to be getting minutes. The Kings are going to be a solid team. I just don't think the fantasy value is necessarily there for Murray to get all the way up to 32 fantasy points per game, which is what he's averaging and is around roughly where he's getting drafted at, is what they sort of expect him to be averaging. I'm just really not that high on him this year, honestly. I just don't really see it. And as I've already said from the guys listed below, I think you're plenty better off taking one of them instead if they're there on your draft boards. I didn't even have him ranked in my top 100 this year, although he is definitely close to breaking into it. But I mean, like I said, I just don't think he's a top 100 player this season for the reasons I've already stated. And I think there's a lot better value you could be grabbing this year instead of looking for a guy whose role is pretty set on his team. I'm not really seeing this magical leap that they're sort of predicting. Yes, he's going to have good games where he maybe gets 40 fantasy points a night, but I think overall in the season, I'm not really expecting him to get above 30 fantasy points per game on average. So definitely consider looking for other small forwards. I already put a few in here like OG and Keldon. I think I would rather have those. I think he's listed as a power forward. I don't know when ESPN is going to update that dual position, but I think last year he was listed at small forward and power forward. But I mean, if he is listed as power forward, you can definitely find some better options as well. So go ahead and get on to the fourth player. Moving on, we have DAngelo Russell. This one is probably one of the more controversial ones on my list. His average draft position, 84.4, and his rank is 74. And I mean, the guys that I would draft instead are pretty much all of the guys that I just listed for Keegan Murray. I totally understand, like, DAngelo Russell, former All-Star, he is a really solid player. I just think for the Lakers, there's just a very limited role for him when he's playing beside AD and LeBron. Plus, they have Gabe Vincent. Austin Reeves is taking a leap this season. I don't see him averaging 35 fantasy points per game this year. He also misses a fair bit of time, as is traditionally his thing, but he's just very inconsistent in his fantasy production. Some nights he's giving you like solid 30 fantasy points. Other nights if his shot's not falling, because he's not too good at getting to the free throw line, not too good at getting to the rim. He's capable of just having some down fantasy nights, which definitely hurts his averages on the season. And yeah, just overall, I didn't have him in my top 100, but I had him on the very edge. I had him ranked at like 102, 101. So he's very close to breaking into the top 100. And if you can get him around the 100th pick, then I think that's a very good option. But taking him at 74, I just think that's 25 spots of value too far, in my opinion. You're just making a little bit of a reach there, just kind of based on the namesake of DAngelo Russell. And I mean, maybe he proves me wrong and has a stellar season, but I'm just more confident in guys like, Nick Claxton, Devin Vassell, OG Anunoby, Chris Paul, Trey Jones. These are all guys I'm looking at drafting instead of DAngelo, just because I'm a bit more confident in what I'm going to get out of them. I'm not too sure what the Lakers' rotations are going to look like. Maybe DAngelo does play and gets a lot of minutes, but even then, I mean, LeBron's the primary ball handler. Reeves looks like he's taken a leap. I think he might even be better than DAngelo Russell this season. I mean, maybe that's a hot take, but I don't know, man. Reeves looks very solid, especially at the FIBA World Cup this year. I was very impressed with how he was playing. And yeah, I sort of talked about him in the top 100 video as well. This is going to be a shorter video just because I don't want to drag on for too long. I'm just kind of giving you my reasoning as to why I wouldn't draft these players as high as their average draft position is, and just sort of trying to justify that claim. So DAngelo Russell is someone that I think could finish top 100, but I just think 74 is a bit too high of a reach. I would look at taking him in the 80s to 90s. I would be fine with that. But yeah, in the 70s, there's just so many better options, as is the case with all the guys I'm mentioning, and I don't really think you need to waste a pick on that when you can probably get someone like, I mean, his right after him is Nick Claxton, who I just made a video on saying he's the biggest sleeper. I mean, I don't know who's drafting DAngelo Russell over Nick Claxton at this point. It's just kind of weird to me. Maybe people are caught up in the big name hype. I think that's probably it for like the more casual players. They're drafting them a bit early, but you got to remember he's not too good at getting to the rim, getting free throw lines. He can be inconsistent with his scoring because of that. Yes, he's a good playmaker, but LeBron is going to be playmaking now, Gabe Vincent and Austin Reeves. So I just think all of those factors kind of play into a detrimental effect to his value, and I would look at taking some other guys instead of him this year, in the 70s range anyway. And last but not least, we have the bald legend Derek White. He is getting drafted around 114th on average, and while, that might not seem like too bad of a pick, some people in some shallower leagues, once you get to the end of the draft, you don't really care as much, but for people in deeper leagues and for people that are more serious about fantasy, the picks are still important, and I think he should not be getting drafted ahead of guys like Mark Williams, Markelle Fultz, RJ Barrett, Jalen Duren, and Mike Conley. If we look at the Celtics, I mean, Derek White is now like the 5th option scoring-wise on the team. He's a very solid player, good defender, but statistically, I just don't see how he puts up the fantasy numbers required to be getting drafted over guys that I've mentioned. I didn't have him ranked in my top 100, obviously. I do think he is a bit lower than right now where he's getting drafted at 114. I think he's more in the 120s just because there's a lot of sneakily good players at this range that are for some reason getting drafted a lot lower than they should be. And I made a whole video talking about that in my sleepers video, so go ahead and check that out if you want some of my takes there. But yeah, I just don't really see Derek White's fantasy value sort of holding up this season just because of the additions of Kristaps Porzingis, Drew Holiday. I mean, he already wasn't like averaging too many fantasy points. He averaged like 28 fantasy points per game last year. I think that probably takes a little bit of a dip this year, around 25 fantasy points. Just like I was saying, just there's less shots for him. He's not going to be playmaking as much now that Drew Holiday's there. He's not going to have the ball in his hands as much. He's very much going to be like 3-and-D oriented. He's going to be getting the minutes. But yeah, I just really don't see the justification for rostering him or picking him over guys that are going to be getting starting minutes and aren't so bogged down by superstars getting in their way. So we got guys like Mark Williams, like I mentioned, Markelle Fultz, RJ Barrett, who I think is going to be improved this year. I've been watching him in the FIBA World Cup, and now his three-point shot looks a bit better from the corner. It looks like it's very like mechanically practiced. I think it looks like he put a lot of work into it this summer, just from my eye test anyway. So we will see if that holds true. I don't know why I'm talking about RJ Barrett instead of Derek White. This is probably just a shout out to Sam, give you some RJ Barrett content. But yeah, I just think Derek White, his value is taking a little bit of a hit this year. I don't think it's going to be like super drastic, but I think you can just get better guys at 114 essentially. So that's going to do it for today's video. Thank you guys so much for watching as always. Hopefully we're all excited for the start of the NBA season starting here, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day.